This lecture is for my Anatomy and Physiology 1 students, and where I am picking up is where we left off talking about connective tissue. So we talked about 3 types of connective tissue so far. We have loose connective, dense connective, and adipose tissue. And what I have here is I pulled up your PowerPoint so we can kind of pick up where we left off. You'll find that familiar. So those are the 3 types of connective tissue that we've covered so far, and we're going on to number 4, which is reticular. So as I'm doing this, I'm going to try to type it in, the information about reticular. So things to know about reticular connective tissue is that it has a high cell content. Okay, high cell content, and it takes on a branched appearance. Okay, so where we usually find reticular connective tissue is surrounding the organs. It acts as a support around the organs. So you can think of it as kind of like a netting around the organs. Since it has a high cell content, what we also find there are fibers. So fibers going in different directions. Also think of it like a web of fibers. So if you ever wondered how your blood vessels kind of stay in place, it has to be because of the reticular connective tissue that surrounds the blood vessels. Okay, so that's it of reticular. As we get to different organ systems and organs, that when it becomes significant, we'll pull that up again. So just remember, when we're talking about the tissues, we're just touching on the main subjects. Okay, so let's move on to the cartilage. So cartilage is another type. Let me move this. Well, can't. So cartilage. The main things to know about cartilage is it's made up of I don't know why that thing's in the middle. Oh, made up of dense collagen and elastic fibers. So dense means that it's very compact and it has a lot of collagen and elastic fibers. There's 3 types of cartilage, and I have it listed for you. So we have hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. Hyaline, first of all, is the type of cartilage that your skeleton is made up of. Most of your skeleton is made up of. And when you add in new bone, it's always going to be hyaline. So those of you who are still growing or your skeleton is still growing, it's laying down new bone, it's hyaline cartilage. Elastic cartilage is a little bit different. Elastic cartilage has more elastic fibers in it. And so the pinna of your ear, is made up of elastic cartilage. And anytime you have lots of elastic fibers, kind of like an elastic rubber band, it's going to snap back into place. So if you take your ear and fold it over and let go, it'll snap back into place. That's elastic cartilage. Also, the tip of your nose, right? You can feel the bone, but after you feel the bone, you feel it gets soft, but there's kind of something hard in there. That's your elastic cartilage. The 3rd type is the fibrocartilage. So the fibrocartilage is more dense with collagen fibers, and it's where we find lots of heavy pressure on the skeleton. So the intervertebral discs and the pubis. All right, so on your worksheets, you had to look up the 3 different types of cartilage and tell about that. And so I do want you to know the major differences between the types of cartilage. But before we move on to other types of connective tissue, I want to tell you the name of the cartilage cells. So the mature cartilage cells are called chondrocytes. So remember when we were talking about in connective tissue where you have blast cells and site cells? The blast cells were the immature cells that help form the tissue, and the site that had the suffix of site, C-Y-T-E, those were the mature cells. So in cartilage, we have chondrocytes. Chondro, that prefix means cartilage. Okay, let me move it up, and then we'll go on to number 6. Okay, number 6 is bone tissue, but the more proper term for bone tissue is osseous tissue. And so what it does, what bone gives us the ability to do, is to walk around. Our muscles are connected to our bones, and when we can contract our muscles, it pulls on the bones and moves that body part. And so the osseous tissue in general gives us the support, and it also protects our other organs. So how is this different? So how is osseous tissue different from other types of connective tissue? That's because it has a high collagen content. High collagen content and a high calcium salt content. Oh, maybe I'll get it in there. All right, so on bone, there's 2 major types of bone. So we're going to do A and B. So we have spongy bone and compact bone. And those are kind of slang terms for the osseous tissue. When we get to the bones, we get to the skeletal system, we'll get into a little bit more detail. And in lab, you'll get into more detail about the particular bones. So spongy bone, let me tell you a little bit about that. The extracellular matrix of spongy bone looks like lattice. If you don't know what lattice is, it also looks like tiny thin columns in that spongy bone. Or think of a dry sponge with all the openings. That's what that type of bone looks like. So what do you think that type of bone would be good for? You probably learned this in lab, but it provides a framework, right? It provides a framework, and it holds steady and holds tight that bone. Then we have compact bone. So compact bone, I'm going to try to move this over. Nope, not going to work. There we go. Uh-oh. All right, so compact bone. The extracellular matrix of compact bone. Oops. The extracellular matrix of compact bone is concentric rings, made up of concentric rings. So if you can look, I'm going to try to move this picture over and maybe blow it up. so you can see the picture. But right in here, you're seeing compact bone. And this is a histio slide of compact bone. And you should be familiar with this because you covered some of this in lab. So compact bone made up of these concentric rings. And one concentric ring, so going from here to here, has a name. Do you remember the name? It's called an osteon. So hopefully you got that right. They're made up of osteons. So one osteon right next to each other. This particular slide is showing a cross section, but if we saw it elongated, it would look like a bunch of straws all there together. And where you're going to find the living cells of bone is going to be right in those little dark areas right in there. So I know you've covered this one in lab, and we had also mentioned it in lecture before too, but the type of cells that secrete the extracellular matrix of bone, those are osteoblasts. Osteo, think osseous tissue. Blast cells, these are the immature cells. They do all the secreting, and they are making the extracellular matrix. So the osteoblasts secrete the extracellular matrix of either type, and then what happens is they mature into osteocytes. They mature into osteocytes. Then they're mainly concerned with maintenance and repair of the extracellular matrix. All right, let's see if I can zoom back out. There we go, a little. Oh. Okay, we're going to keep going and on to our next type of connective tissue. So number 7, and that is liquid connective. Liquid connective tissue. You probably didn't even know there was even such a thing in the body as liquid connective tissue, but there is. There's actually 2 types. First type is blood. So blood is a liquid connective tissue. How do we know that blood is a connective tissue? We have to go back and look at the cells, the very, very early precursors to the cells that give rise to the stem cells that are found in blood. Okay, so blood. Blood has a liquid extracellular matrix. I'm just going to put EM. Liquid extracellular matrix. Do you know what the liquid portion of the blood is called? Try to guess. Let's see if you were right. It's called plasma. So the blood plasma. The blood plasma is the liquid extracellular matrix. So what else do we find besides the extracellular matrix in connective tissue? We find the living cells. So in blood, the group that the living cells are in, those are called formed elements. And there are 3 formed elements. We have the red blood cells, or erythrocytes, the white blood cells, leukocytes, and we have the platelets. So platelets. Now, you're probably wondering, why do we call it formed elements? Why can't we just say the living cells of the tissue? Well, the thing is, yes, red blood cells, erythrocytes are cells, white blood cells are cells, but platelets are actually cell fragments. What happens in the development of a platelet is that there is this one big cell that is released into the blood from the bone marrow, and it breaks up into tiny little pieces. What you can imagine is having a really big plate and just slamming it down onto concrete, and all those little shards that you would find, all those different sizes and different shapes. That's exactly what these platelets are like. And so they are traveling in the blood. They're much smaller than the living cells, clearly, just like those little shards of the plate would be. And the platelets function in blood clotting. Okay. All right, so in blood, we have the liquid extracellular matrix, which is the blood plasma. Then we have our formed elements we just talked about a little bit. And then, see if I can work this. What else we find there is plasma proteins. So plasma proteins, you already know what plasma is, that's the liquid portion. But if we look in that liquid portion, we're going to find a lot of stuff. And one of the major things that we find there are proteins. So much so that we call them plasma proteins. These have lots of different functions, and many of them are for transport of other molecules in the blood. All right. So we are now on to the other type of liquid connective tissue, which is lymph. L-Y-M-P-H, lymph. Okay, so what is lymph? Well, first of all, let's find out, where do we find lymph? Lymph is found inside lymphatic vessels. It's found inside lymphatic vessels. Now, lymphatic vessels, you may have seen these in some of the models in lab, but when we think of vessels, we always think of blood vessels, and you can imagine, you can visualize the blood vessels, right? Whether it's in models or pictures that you've seen, and they kind of pop right out at you, right? Usually when it's in a picture or in a model, they're colored different colors. So we have the arteries are red, the veins are blue. But as it turns out, we have this whole other set of vessels in our body. And for the most part, wherever we find blood vessels, we're going to find neighboring lymphatic vessels. Now on pictures and models, the lymphatic vessels are usually colored green. So look for those the next time that you go into the lab. So inside lymphatic vessels. Now we're just talking about the lymph, the liquid stuff that's found in those vessels. The clear liquid that's found in lymph is the extracellular matrix. So extracellular matrix is a clear liquid. Okay, what does this liquid do? Try to move this up a little bit. It mainly transports lipids and immune cells. So think of the lymphatic vessels as being a big drainage, also another drainage system. And it's draining the fluid that's found around your cells. And so when you have too much of this fluid, or it actually goes on all the time, but it will drain that fluid. It then becomes lymph fluid, and eventually it'll all make itself back into, that doesn't make any sense. Eventually it'll make its way back into the blood vessels. It dumps into the blood vessels, back into the normal circulation. Okay, so I just want to come back up here, and this is where we are. We're talking about number 7, and this is our last connective tissue. Because really my goal in going over the tissues was to kind of introduce you to those tissues. Then as we get to the organ systems, we're going to talk about how they function in those organ systems. So this is just kind of a brief overview of those. All right, so now we're going to move on to muscle tissue. And I'm going to move some things around somehow. Thought this would be kind of neat to work with. But, you know, I'm no expert at it. Just trying to do my best here. Let's move this. I'm gonna keep moving it down. Maybe. I don't know. Gotta move it. Okay, hold on. I know you're sick of me saying that. Okay. Oops. My goal is I want you to be able to see this slide, use it kind of as an outline like we do normally, and also be able to see what I type up here, which I'm not really good at either. Sorry, guys. It's not going to work. Okay. So on to muscle tissue. So muscle tissue is another type of tissue. It was one of our four. And muscle tissue, we're going to talk a lot more about muscle tissue because it's the main component of the muscular system. So when we get to the muscular system, so this is just really going to be an overview of it. I can move this up. Okay. The first thing I want to talk about is the characteristics of muscle tissue. Characteristics. All right. One, you know what? Let me number these. Oh no. Hold on. Okay. All right. Here we go. One characteristic of muscle tissue is that most of the muscle tissue has these elongated cells. And they're so long that when they first started looking at them, they thought they were the fibers. They thought they were fibers. Fibers long, skinny. These cells were long and skinny. And so that's how they got their name. So I kind of toggle between calling them muscle cells in the beginning to calling them muscle fibers. And then later on, you'll only hear me say muscle fibers. So they're way different. They look way different than the rest of the cells. That's most of the muscle cells. Okay. Thinking of the tissue, it is highly cellular. So muscle tissue has lots of cells within that tissue. Okay, another characteristic, it is well vascularized. We talked about what vascularized means, and that means it has lots of blood vessels in that tissue. Lots of blood vessels in the tissue. Oh, sorry, hold on. All right, it is responsible for movement. So our muscle tissue is responsible for movement. It exerts force on other types of tissues. So it's responsible for a few different types of movement, but we'll discuss that when we get to the muscular system. So exerting force on other tissues. I said this a little bit earlier when we were talking about the skeleton and bones, but muscles, skeletal muscles are attached to bone, and when we contract skeletal muscles, they pull on our bones, okay, and it helps to move. So it's exerting a force onto the osseous tissue, other types of tissue. And so there's some other examples as well as for other types of muscle tissue. So this is a characteristic. We can call this a function as well. Okay, there are 3 types of muscle tissue. There is skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle. So I'm gonna see what I can do about moving this. Actually, yeah. Oh, all right. So the 3 types of muscle tissue. 1, skeletal. Okay, skeletal. All right, skeletal muscles. Think of this. There's skeletal muscles, skeleton, attached to the bones of the skeleton. So skeletal muscles are attached to the bones of the skeleton. So this is true for almost all of our skeletal muscles. There are a couple exceptions, and these are some very small muscles in the face. But for the most part, all skeletal muscles are attached to the skeleton. That's how they got their name. Okay, types of movement. The skeletal muscles produce voluntary movement. So produce voluntary movement. That means there has to be some intention in moving that, in contracting the muscle. So we think of motor neurons. We are not the neurons yet, but there is a conscious control over the muscles. Okay, and looking at that type of muscle, we have a name for what it looks like, and it's called striated. S-T-R-I-A-T-E-D, striated. Now, striated is another term for striped, and it got that name by what it physically looks like. So if you take a look where my cursor is, I know this is a very small histio slide, but it looks striped. So it got the name of striated. Now, what is causing those striations are 2 major types of proteins that are called actin and myosin. So these are proteins. This is kind of the major proteins found in muscle fibers. And it has to do with the orientation of the actin and the myosin. All right, so that is skeletal. Try to move that off. All right, another type is cardiac. Cardiac muscle. Okay, I bet you can't figure out where cardiac muscle is found, can you? I know you don't. It's found in the heart. So cardiac muscle is found in the heart, and it is responsible for the involuntary. I spelled that wrong. I'll get it. All right, so responsible for the involuntary movement of the heart. We're going to talk lots about that when we get to the cardiovascular system. A couple other tidbits of information you need to know is that the cells found there, the muscle fibers that make up the cardiac muscle, we have a special name for them. They are called myocytes. So let's look at that word, myocytes. Sites you recognize. Myo, that prefix MYO. MYO means muscle. So you might think, well, why is that special? Why is cardiac muscle fiber, aren't they all called myocytes? Technically, they kind of are, but I can tell you in primary literature and when professionals talk about the cells that are found only in cardiac muscle fiber, they only refer to those as myocytes. Okay, so they only refers to those as myocytes. The others, cardiac muscle fiber or muscle fibers. Okay, cardiac muscle fibers are cardiac muscle tissue is also striated. So you know what striated means? It's because it's striped. And why is it striped? It has to do with the orientation of the actin and the myosin. All right, so on to the third type. Smooth muscle. All right, so smooth muscle, they named it smooth muscle because it didn't have the stripes. It was not striated. The other two are striated. This type of muscle is not striated. So to the eye, it looks smooth, and that's how it got its name. Now, where do we find smooth muscle? Smooth muscle, I'm gonna try to move this up. Okay, smooth muscle is found in the walls of the hollow organs, found in the respiratory tract, the urinary tract. Okay, so let's go back to this, found in the walls of the hollow organs. So let's think about that, hollow organs. Can you think of any hollow organs? What you probably thought of was like the stomach, and you're right, right? It's hollow. And technically, if we look at the digestive tract, right, the whole digestive tract, all connected, and they're all basically hollow. Different segments of the digestive tract are highly modified for their functions. But the entire digestive tract, with some exception, is lined in smooth muscle. Okay. The overall function of smooth muscle is to propel substances along. Now, if you think of the digestive tract, yeah, that makes sense. Because when the smooth muscle contracts, it's going to move the food along, okay? And we'll talk more about that when we get to the muscular system. This one is smooth, not striated, non-striated. Okay, and it is involuntary. Oops. We're trying to type with an elevated keyboard. That's why I keep messing up. Okay. So those are the major differences between the types. And like I said, when we get to the muscular system, you're going to learn more than you ever wanted to know about those types of muscles, tissue. Okay. Scroll this down. And then we will move on to our final type of connective tissue. Try it again. All right, nervous tissue. All right, so nervous tissue. One thing to know about the nervous tissue, that it's similar to the muscle tissue is that it makes up the main component of the nervous system. So the nervous tissue makes up the main component of the nervous system. Now, overall, if we had to give a function to it, what does it do? Regulates and controls body functions. So where do we find nervous tissue? It's found in the brain, spinal cord, nerves, ganglia. Now, you may have covered ganglia in lab so far, but what ganglia is, an easy way to remember what ganglia is. They're not like swellings of nerves. So we have our nerves, and then we have this ganglia. Ganglia kind of look like a big mangled bunch of nerves, basically, and we call that a ganglia. All right, there are two types of cells that are found in this type of tissue. That's what I want to concentrate on. The first one, neurons. Now, for us right now, we're just talking about doing an overall, what are the major functions, just introduction to this type of tissue. Now, neurons, what do they do? They generate and conduct impulses. So if we had to pick like the star of the nervous tissue, it's going to be the neurons, right? Neurons get all the attention. They always get the attention because even when we think of nervous tissue, we imagine neurons, right? We imagine these neurons and we imagine the impulses that are generated along those neurons. So they really are the star of the tissues. They generate and conduct nerve impulses. Okay, other type of cells there that are found there collectively are called supporting cells. Okay, we have a more technical term for them. And they are known as neuroglia. Silly little name, neuroglia. And a lot of times it gets shortened to glial cells or glia cells. Oh! What? Oh, I wonder if I can get it back. Oh, your lucky day. Okay. Supporting cells, neuroglia or glia cells. If you're talking about just one of them, so singular, glial with an L. Okay, these are non-conductive cells. So this means that these cells do not generate or conduct impulses. They do not. So what are they there for, really? They support, insulate, and protect the neurons. They're really there for support staff, right? So they're the support staff for the neurons. All right. So we just did a little overview of all of the tissues, and it's just kind of just to introduce you to those tissues. Then when we get to the systems, then we'll be talking about how do those tissues function? How do the tissues function in relation to the other tissues surrounding them? All right, so that's it of tissues. I'm going to end this particular lecture, and then we have a little bit more, but I want to start on the integumentary system. So this finishes the rest of your tissues. And then look for the next one, which will start your integumentary system. So thanks for hanging in there with me.